If you think you know what hell looks like, you haven't been to San Quentin. Before we walk through those gates together, smash that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me if you survive one day behind these walls. Trust me, after this story, you'll never look at justice the same way again. The morning fog rolled thick across San Francisco Bay on March 14, 2019, wrapping around San Quentin State Prison like a shroud. Inside the oldest prison in California, something was about to shatter the uneasy peace that had held for decades. Death Row, a place where over 700 condemned men waited in limbo between life and execution, was about to become the center of an investigation that would expose secrets the state never wanted revealed. Correctional Officer Marcus Chun had worked Death Row for 12 years. He'd seen everything, or so he thought. Men who'd committed unspeakable acts. Men who claimed innocence until their final breath. Men who'd found God, and men who'd lost their minds. But nothing prepared him for what he discovered during the routine 6 a.m. cell check that Thursday morning. Cell 47, East Block. The door was closed, locked from the outside, as protocol demanded. Through the small observation window, Marcus could see the bunk, neatly made. Standard, but something felt wrong. The air itself seemed different, charged with an electricity that made the hair on his neck stand up. He radioed for backup before opening the door, a decision that would later save his career and possibly his life. When the lock disengaged and the door swung open, Marcus found himself staring at an empty cell. Not just empty of its occupant, but stripped. The walls, normally covered with the clutter of a man who'd lived in this 6 by 9 foot space for 18 years, were bare. No photographs, no legal papers, no books, nothing. And in the center of the stripped mattress sat a single manila envelope with 2 words written in precise block letters: the truth. Inside that envelope were 47 pages that would ignite the biggest investigation in California, Department of Corrections history. Pages that detailed a network of corruption, murder for hire, and conspiracy that stretched from death row to the highest levels of state government. But the most chilling part wasn't what was written on those pages. It was who had written them. The missing inmate was Daniel Torres, convicted in 2001 for the brutal murder of Superior Court Judge Patricia Lansing and her husband in their Marin County home. The case had been sensational. Torres, a former defense attorney, had allegedly snapped after Judge Lansing repeatedly ruled against his clients. The evidence was overwhelming. His DNA at the scene, the murder weapon registered in his name, and a paper trail showing he'd purchased rope and bleach the day before the killings. He'd maintained his innocence through trial, through appeals, through 18 years of fighting his death sentence. But the jury had deliberated for only 4 hours. Now he was gone, vanished from the most secure section of one of America's most infamous prisons. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan arrived within 20 minutes. A 30-year veteran of corrections, she'd investigated everything from contraband smuggling to inmate assaults. But a disappearance from death row? Impossible. She stood in that empty cell, reading those 47 pages, and felt the ground shift beneath her feet. According to Torres's document, he hadn't killed Judge Lansing. He couldn't have, because he'd been framed by the real killer, someone who'd needed the judge dead and needed Torres to take the fall, someone with unlimited access to evidence, someone who understood the system intimately enough to manipulate it. The document named names, provided dates, described meetings that had never made it into any official record. It detailed payments made through shell companies, evidence planted and evidence destroyed. It told the story of a conspiracy that had successfully sent an innocent man to death row while the real killer walked free. And if Torres was telling the truth about being framed, how had he escaped from a cell that was supposed to be escape-proof? Sarah's team worked through the morning, interviewing guards, checking security footage, analyzing the cell inch by inch. The prison went into immediate lockdown. 700 men confined to their cells while every corridor, every yard, every space was searched. But San Quentin spans 432 acres. There are places in that ancient fortress, built in 1852, that haven't been mapped in decades. Tunnels that were forgotten. Passages that existed before modern security systems. Finding one man in that labyrinth seemed impossible. The security footage gave them nothing. Camera 17, which covered cell 47, had experienced a malfunction at 11:47 p.m. the previous night, static for 6 minutes. When it came back online, everything appeared normal. But sometime during those 6 minutes, or perhaps before, or perhaps after, Daniel Torres had ceased to exist inside San Quentin State Prison. By noon, the FBI had arrived. By 2 p.m., the media had gotten wind of something major happening at the prison. By 5 p.m., the governor's office was demanding answers. And by 8 p.m. that night, when Sarah Brennan sat in the prison warden's office reviewing everything they knew, she made a discovery that turned the entire investigation inside out. She'd been going through Torres's prison records, looking for any hint of planning or outside help. His visitor logs showed the usual. His court-appointed attorney every few months, his sister twice a year, a priest who came monthly. But then Sarah noticed something odd. 6 weeks earlier, Torres had received a visitor he'd never had before. Someone who'd gotten special clearance to meet with him. Someone whose name made Sarah's blood run cold because she recognized it immediately. The visitor worked for the California Attorney General's office. The same office that had prosecuted Torres 18 years ago. The same office that had fought every one of his appeals. Why would someone from that office visit a death row inmate they'd helped convict, especially after nearly 2 decades? Sarah pulled the visitor's name and started running background checks. Within an hour, she'd found the connection. The visitor, Deputy Attorney General Rachel Morrison, had worked under Judge Patricia Lansing before Lansing took the bench. They'd been close. Very close. Some records suggested Morrison had been Lansing's protege, her chosen successor, which meant Morrison would have had every reason to want Torres convicted. But it also meant Morrison might have had access to information about Lansing's murder that others didn't. Information about the investigation, about the evidence, about exactly how that case had been built. Sarah kept digging, and what she found in Morrison's background made her hands shake as she held the files. Morrison's ex-husband, divorced in 2003, 2 years after Torres's conviction, had been a crime scene investigator. One who'd worked the Lansing murder scene. One who'd collected the evidence that convicted Torres. The pieces were falling into place, but they formed a picture so disturbing that Sarah almost didn't want to see it complete. If Torres was telling the truth, if he'd been framed, then the people who'd framed him were still out there. Still in positions of power. Still able to manipulate the system. And now Torres had escaped, carrying information that could destroy them. But when they opened the prison's archived evidence locker to pull the original Lansing murder case files for comparison with Torres' claims, what they found changed everything.
The evidence locker at San Quentin was supposed to be a fortress of certainty, climate-controlled, secure, meticulously organized. But standing in the musty, underground room, Sarah Brennan realized it was none of those things. She was surrounded by decades of forgotten cases, ghosts of California's justice system, and she was staring at an empty shelf. The label was there, yellowed and curling at the edges: Casi 2014 People v. Torres, Judge Patricia Lansing, homicide. But the boxes, the sealed bags, the very proof that had sent Daniel Torres to death row, it was all gone. The logbook told a chilling story. The evidence had been signed out 7 times since the conviction, 3 times by defense attorneys, twice by the AG's office, once by a filmmaker who was denied, and then there was the last entry from just 6 weeks ago, signed out on January 29th by Deputy Attorney General Rachel Morrison. The same Rachel Morrison who had recently visited Torres. The same Rachel Morrison who had once worked for the murdered judge, and she had never signed it back in. By 9:45, federal agents were swarming Morrison's Sacramento home. By 10:03, they were breaking down her door. Rachel Morrison was dead. She'd been dead for at least 3, maybe 4 days. Her body was found in her home office, a single gunshot wound to the head, her service weapon in her hand. It looked like a suicide. But the scene was wrong. The house was torn apart, ransacked by someone searching for something. And whatever it was, they must have found it because the Lansing murder evidence wasn't there. The suicide note on her desk was brief, typed, and unsigned. "I can't live with what I've done. I'm sorry." But the FBI techs were suspicious. The angle of the wound, the position of the body, the distinct lack of blood spatter where there should have been. It was all staged. A performance of suicide, but the execution was sloppy. Sarah drove through the night, arriving at Morrison's house at 2 a.m. Agent Park met her at the door, his face a mask of exhaustion. "You need to see her computer," he said, leading her through the wreckage of the home. On the screen was an email draft, never sent, addressed to the California Commission on Judicial Appointments. It was dated just 3 days before Morrison's estimated time of death. It began with a bombshell. "I am writing to confess my role in a conspiracy that resulted in the wrongful conviction of Daniel Torres." It was 11 pages long, a detailed confession that confirmed everything Torres had claimed in his own document. But Morrison's version had names, bank accounts, recorded phone calls, and photographs. She had been secretly collecting evidence for years, documenting a vast conspiracy that went to the highest levels of the state's justice system. According to her draft, Judge Lansing hadn't been killed by a vengeful attorney. She was murdered because she'd discovered a massive bribery scheme. A private prison corporation, Sentinel Corrections LLC, was paying judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials to ensure longer sentences and deny parole. Keeping prisons full was just good business. Judge Lansing found out and was about to blow the whistle when she was silenced. And the person who planted the evidence to frame Daniel Torres, it was Rachel Morrison's own ex-husband, a crime scene investigator named James Morrison. He was paid $200,000 to contaminate the scene with Torres's DNA, which he'd lifted from a glass Torres used at a bar. He planted the murder weapon, stolen from Torres's home during a so-called neighborhood canvassing, and fabricated a paper trail. Then he testified under oath and sealed Torres's fate. But here's the twist. Rachel claimed she didn't know about the frame-up at first. She truly believed Torres was guilty. The truth only came out 5 years ago when her ex-husband was dying of cancer and confessed everything in a moment of guilt. He died, leaving Rachel with a secret that could destroy careers and expose decades of corruption. For 5 years, she was paralyzed by fear. Exposing the conspiracy meant exposing herself as an accomplice. Then, 6 weeks ago, something changed. She visited Torres on death row. Security footage showed her breaking down, confessing everything to him through the reinforced glass. Morrison was going to expose them. Someone found out, came to her house, took the evidence, and staged her suicide. But another terrifying possibility began to form in Sarah's mind. What if Torres didn't escape? What if he was taken? The perfectly timed camera malfunction, the stripped cell. It didn't look like an extraction, a professional hit designed to silence him for good. Agent Park broke the silence. "We've been going through Morrison's phone records," he said. 17 calls to the same burner phone in the 3 days before she died. "We traced it. Last ping was from a cell tower in Marin County, same county where Judge Lansing was killed." Sarah pulled up the photos Morrison had saved. There were secret meetings between judges and Sentinel executives, bank statements showing huge payments. Then, buried in a folder, a surveillance photo that made her blood run cold. It showed 2 men meeting in a parking garage. One was a stranger. The other was the current California Attorney General Marcus Webb. The man who'd built his career on being tough on crime. The man who had been meeting with a Sentinel executive just 3 months ago. If Webb was involved, they weren't just fighting a few corrupt officials. They were fighting the entire system. At 3:47 a.m., Sarah's phone rang. It was Park. "The Marin team found something. You need to get here now. Bring everyone you can. We've got a situation." She flew down the highway, arriving at an abandoned warehouse just as dawn was breaking. Federal agents had the place surrounded. Parked behind the building, hidden from the road, was Rachel Morrison's car. The trunk was open. Inside were 3 of the evidence boxes. 4 were still missing. Sprawled on the ground next to the car was a body. It was Correctional Officer Robert Hayes, one of the guards on duty the night Torres vanished. He'd been shot twice in the chest. "We've got heat signatures inside," Park said, his weapon drawn. "At least 3 people. SWAT is getting in position." Before he could finish, the warehouse erupted in a massive fireball. The shockwave threw Sarah to the ground as debris rained down. Any evidence, any answers were being turned to ash. But then, in the chaos, she saw it. A figure moving through the smoke at the edge of the property, moving away from the fire into the morning fog. A tall, lean man wearing what looked like prison blues. She only saw him for a second before he disappeared. But it was enough. Daniel Torres was alive, and he was running.
Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran after the figure, ignoring Agent Park's shouts behind her. Her lungs burned as she sprinted through the fog, following the shadow that moved just ahead of her. Torres, if it was him, knew she was coming. He led her away from the warehouse, away from the FBI and the burning building, into a maze of abandoned industrial buildings that lined the waterfront. She finally found him standing on an old loading dock, his back to the bay, with nowhere left to run. Up close, Daniel Torres looked nothing like his 18-year-old mugshot. Prison had carved his face into sharp angles, his eyes holding the kind of deep exhaustion that came from fighting a system designed to break him. But he wasn't broken. He was alert, alive, and most importantly, he was clutching a waterproof case to his chest like his life depended on it. "It's over, Mr. Torres," Sarah said, her hand resting on her weapon but not drawing it. "Whatever you're doing, whatever this is, it ends now." Torres laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "Over? Detective? It's just beginning. Morrison tried to expose them, and they killed her. Hayes helped me escape because his daughter was threatened by Sentinel's people, and they killed him too. Everyone who tries to bring the truth to light ends up dead. That's how this works. That's how it's always worked." "Then give me what's in that case," Sarah said, taking a cautious step closer. "Let me help you. Let the system work the way it's supposed to." "The system?" Torres's voice rose with disbelief and anger. "I trusted the system. I was part of the system. I defended people in that system. And the system put me on death row for a murder I didn't commit because I was convenient, because framing me was easier than finding the real killer." He held up the case. "This has everything. Morrison's evidence. Audio recordings of Webb authorizing payments. Contracts between Sentinel and state officials. Proof that over 300 convictions in California were influenced by bribes. 300 people, detective. 300 lives destroyed, so a private prison company could increase its profit margin." Sarah's radio crackled. It was Agent Park calling for her location. They'd be here in minutes. She had to make a choice. Trust the system that had failed Torres, that had failed Morrison, that had allowed a conspiracy to flourish for 2 decades? Or trust the man standing in front of her, the one everyone said was a murderer? "Morrison visited you 6 weeks ago," Sarah said, her voice steady. "She told you everything. How did you get out of San Quentin?" Torres smiled grimly. "I didn't escape, detective. They took me. Sentinel's people, working with guards they'd bought. They thought they could disappear me quietly, make it look like I'd escaped, then kill me. Hayes was supposed to help them, but his conscience got the better of him. He got me out instead, brought me to Morrison. We were supposed to meet at that warehouse, combine our evidence, and go to the media together. But they found us. They killed Hayes. Morrison barely got away, hid the evidence, and called me." He stopped, his voice breaking. "I was supposed to meet her at the warehouse last night, but when I got there, I found her tied to a chair. They'd tortured her, trying to find where she'd hidden the rest of the evidence. When I came in, they were still there. 3 of them. I fought. I got this case. I ran. They chased me back into the warehouse. I didn't know they'd rigged it to explode. I barely made it out. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the buildings. Torres tensed, preparing to run or fight or surrender. Sarah didn't know which. But then he did something she never expected. He held out the case to her. "You're right," he said quietly. "It has to end. But not with me dead and this buried. Take it. Make copies. Send them everywhere. The press, federal prosecutors, every news outlet in the country. Make it impossible to hide. Because if I go back into custody, I'll never make it to trial. You know that. They'll kill me." Sarah took the case, feeling its weight in her hands. Inside was the truth. The truth that could free Torres expose Attorney General Webb, and dismantle Sentinel Corrections. But it was also the truth that could destroy her career, make her a target, and turn her life into the same nightmare Torres had been living for 18 years. Just then, Agent Park and 6 FBI agents rounded the corner, weapons drawn. They saw Torres, saw Sarah holding the case, and moved to surround them both. "Lieutenant Brennan," Park called out. "Step away from him, now." Sarah looked at Torres. She looked at the agents. She looked at the case in her hands. And in that moment, she understood what Morrison must have felt. The weight of knowing the truth. A burden of choosing between the easy lie and the dangerous truth. The cost of doing what was right when right had such a terrible price. She made her choice. 3 months later, the story broke across every major news network simultaneously. Attorney General Marcus Webb arrested on corruption charges. Sentinel Corrections executives indicted. 17 judges suspended pending investigation. Over 200 cases were being reviewed for potential wrongful convictions. And at the center of it all was the evidence from a waterproof case that had somehow found its way to every major newspaper, television network, and online news site in America on the same day. Daniel Torres was released from custody. All charges dropped, the state offering him a settlement that couldn't begin to compensate for 18 years on death row. He disappeared from public view immediately, refusing interviews, refusing to be part of the media circus his story had become. Sarah Brennan resigned from corrections and took a job as a private investigator. Agent Park was promoted to head the FBI's new Public Corruption Task Force in California. But the story didn't end there, because 6 months after Webb's arrest, a body was found in Lake Tahoe. It took 3 weeks to identify the remains. It was Attorney General Marcus Webb. He died from a single gunshot wound to the head. The official story was suicide. His death came 2 days before he was scheduled to testify against other members of the conspiracy. And in Webb's pocket, waterproof and sealed, was a single piece of paper with 6 words written in precise block letters. "The truth always finds a way." Nobody ever proved who put it there. The investigation went nowhere. But Daniel Torres, somewhere under a new name in a new life, might have smiled when he heard the news. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from the system. Sometimes it comes despite it. And sometimes the innocent man everyone thought was a monster turns out to be the only one brave enough to fight the real monsters. San Quentin's death row still stands, still holding hundreds of men in limbo. But after the Torres case, people started asking questions. Questions about who really belongs there. Questions about how many other Daniel Tereses are waiting for a truth that might never come. Questions that should have been asked decades ago. And that, perhaps, is the scariest part of all.